In the grand violent theater of naval history, the spotlight often falls on the Titans, the colossal battleships, the globe-spanning aircraft carriers, and the sleek, deadly destroyers that decided the fate of empires. But history's currents are filled with countless other vessels, many of which were forgotten, overlooked, or simply too strange to fit the conventional narrative. Today, we are pulling one such story from the depths. It is a tale of desperation, of bizarre design choices, and of a political irony so thick you could cut it with a bayonet. This is the story of two ships, the pride of a nation, that were conceived in a moment of hope, built by their nation's greatest rival, and destined for a tragic twofold death. They were the Ning Hai-class cruisers, China's flawed, valiant, and utterly unique flagships. Their journey from a designer's drawing board in Japan to a watery grave in the Philippines is one of the most curious chapters of the era leading into World War II. To understand why the Ning Hai-class even existed, we must first travel back to the China of the 1920s. It was a nation in turmoil. The old Qing dynasty had collapsed, but what replaced it was not a stable, unified country. It was a fractured landscape of competing warlords, a fledgling nationalist government trying to assert control, and foreign powers carving out spheres of influence along the coast. The Republic of China, as it was known, was a giant struggling to find its footing. Its navy, the Republic of China Navy, or ROCN, was a reflection of this national chaos. It was, to put it mildly, not a formidable force. The fleet was a patchwork collection of aging, mismatched vessels, many of them leftovers from the previous century. It had a handful of small, protected cruisers, some gunboats, and a few old destroyers. Most of these ships were poorly maintained and their crews were loyal to regional commanders rather than a central government. They could police rivers and show the flag in friendly ports, but against a modern naval power, they stood little chance. And a modern naval power was rising right on their doorstep. The Empire of Japan, having humiliated Russia in 1905 and industrialized at a breathtaking pace, was hungry for resources and territory. Its gaze fell upon the vast, fractured land of its neighbor. The Imperial Japanese Navy, the IJN, was the inverse of China's. It was a disciplined, technologically advanced, and powerful force, boasting some of the finest warships in the world. As Japan's militaristic ambitions grew, it became terrifyingly clear to the Chinese leadership that their coastline, their trade, and their very sovereignty were indefensible. Something had to be done. The nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek began a slow and painful process of consolidating power and modernizing the nation. A key part of this vision was the creation of a new, modern navy. They didn't dream of matching the IJN battleship for battleship. That was a fantasy. The goal was more realistic. To build a credible coastal defense force, they needed ships that could patrol their waters, deter casual aggression, and if the worst came to pass, make any invasion as costly as possible for the enemy. They needed new cruisers. But here was the dragon's dilemma. China had shipyards like the Qiannan dockyard in Shanghai, but they lacked the experience, the tooling, and the technical knowledge to design and construct a modern, complex warship from scratch. So, like many developing nations then and now, they had to look abroad. They needed a foreign partner to provide the design and the expertise. They put out tenders to Britain, to America, to Germany, and in a move that seems almost unbelievable in hindsight, they sent an inquiry to Japan. The decision to approach Japan for a warship was steeped in a bitter, pragmatic irony. In 1931, while negotiations were underway, the Japanese army staged the Mukden incident, manufacturing a pretext to invade and occupy Manchuria, a massive territory in northeastern China. The world watched, but did nothing. Japan was actively seizing Chinese land, and yet the Chinese government was simultaneously negotiating with a Japanese shipyard to build its new flagship. It was a perfect, if painful, illustration of the era's complex politics. China needed the weapon more than it could afford the principle, and for Japanese industry, business was business, even if that business was arming a future adversary. Ultimately, the contract for the lead ship was awarded to Harima Shipyards, a private company in Japan. The plan was twofold. Harima would build the first cruiser, the Ning Hai, entirely in Japan. This would serve as the template. A second, identical ship, the Ping Hai, would be built in China at the Qiannan yard, but using Japanese-supplied plans, machinery, and technical advisors. It was a strategy meant to kickstart China's own shipbuilding industry. They weren't just buying a ship, they were buying knowledge. The design itself was based on Japan's own experimental light cruiser, the Yubari. The Yubari was a revolutionary vessel, a ship that tried to pack the firepower of a 5,000-ton cruiser into a hull half that size. The IJN was a pioneer of this pocket concept, always trying to squeeze more fighting power out of treaty-limited displacements. The Ning Hai was to be even smaller than the Yubari, displacing only about 2,500 tons, barely the size of a large destroyer from other navies. Yet the firepower being crammed onto this tiny hull was immense. The main armament consisted of 6 140mm or 5.5-inch naval guns mounted in 3 twin turrets. These were respectable, powerful weapons for the time, the same type used on Japanese light cruisers. It also carried a formidable suite of anti-aircraft guns, and critically, 2 twin-tube launchers for powerful 533mm torpedoes. On paper, for a ship of its size, the Ning Hai was a monster, a brawler that could punch far above its weight. But the most peculiar feature was its aviation facility. The design included a small hangar below the bridge, large enough to house 2 small seaplanes. The idea was that these aircraft could be used for reconnaissance, spotting for the ship's guns, and hunting submarines. However, in a truly bizarre design choice that screamed of compromise, the ship was not fitted with a catapult. To launch an aircraft, it would have to be hoisted out of the hangar by a crane, placed into the water, and then take off from the sea. This was a slow, cumbersome process that was practically useless in any kind of combat situation or rough seas. It was a feature that looked impressive in a brochure, but was a near-total failure in practice. The construction of Ning Hai in Japan proceeded without major issue. The ship was laid down in February 1931 and commissioned into the Republic of China Navy in September 1932. As she sailed for China, she was the single most powerful and modern surface combatant in the entire fleet. She immediately became the flagship, a symbol of national pride and a glimmer of hope for a modern naval future. She looked the part, with a sleek profile, 3 imposing gun turrets, and the unique, high bridge structure needed to accommodate that hangar. The story of her sister ship, Ping Hai, however, was far more difficult. Her keel was laid at the Qiannan dockyard in Shanghai in June 1931. The plan was for a smooth build, with Japanese steel plates, engines, and engineers guiding their Chinese counterparts. But the political situation was deteriorating rapidly. The Japanese invasion of Manchuria had poisoned relations. In early 1932, the fighting spilled over into Shanghai itself, in what became known as the January 28th incident. Japanese naval forces bombarded the city, and the fighting on the ground was fierce. Suddenly, building a Chinese warship with Japanese help in a city that Japan was actively attacking became impossible. Japan suspended all cooperation. Shipments of essential parts were halted. The technical advisors packed their bags and went home. The hull of the Ping Hai sat on its slipway, an unfinished monument to a failed partnership. For over a year, work stopped completely. The ROCN was desperate to complete the ship, but they had a half-built cruiser with no engines and no armament. It was Germany, another nation positioning itself to rearm and challenge the world order, that stepped in. China turned to Berlin for the missing components. They ordered new anti-aircraft guns and fire control systems. This necessity, however, created a new set of problems. The German equipment was different from the original Japanese design. The gun mounts were a different size. The fire control directors were a different shape. Chinese engineers had to modify the original plans extensively to make everything fit. After years of delay and improvisation, the Ping Hai was finally completed and commissioned in 1936. She took her place in the fleet alongside her sister, but they were no longer identical twins. The Ping Hai had a lower, modified bridge structure because the seaplane hangar had been eliminated. Her anti-aircraft armament was different, and her masts and superstructure had noticeable variations. She was a testament to Chinese perseverance, a ship cobbled together through sheer will. But the compromises had consequences. Both ships suffered from the fundamental flaws of the Yubari concept. In cramming so much weaponry onto such a small hull, they were incredibly top-heavy. All that weight high up, the guns, the bridge, the anti-aircraft platforms, made them roll violently in heavy seas. They were unstable gun platforms, which affected the accuracy of their main batteries. Furthermore, in a cost-saving measure, they were fitted with old-fashioned, inefficient triple-expansion steam engines. These were the kind of engines that had powered ships in the late 19th century. As a result, their top speed was a sluggish 21 knots, or about 24 miles per hour, 39 kilometers per hour. In an era when new cruisers were pushing 35 knots, the Ning Hai-class were ponderously slow. They couldn't chase faster enemies, and more importantly, they couldn't run away. Despite their flaws, they were the best China had. As the 1930s wore on, they trained, they patrolled, and they represented the central government's authority. But the clock was ticking. By 1937, Japan was ready for a full-scale invasion. The Marco Polo Bridge incident in July of that year was the spark that ignited the Second Sino-Japanese War, a conflict that would merge into the global inferno of World War II. As Japanese armies advanced, the Chinese High Command made a desperate strategic decision. They knew they could not defeat the Imperial Japanese Navy in a fleet-on-fleet engagement at sea. To do so would be suicide. Instead, they would use the Navy to defend the heart of the country. They chose to make their stand at the Jianyan Fortress, a critical strategic point on the mighty Yangtze River. The fortress guarded the approach to the capital city, Nanking, which lay about 186 miles, 300 kilometers, upstream. The plan was to block the river entirely. They took every warship they could spare, along with dozens of merchant vessels, and scuttled them, sinking them in the main channel to create an impassable barrier of sunken steel. Behind this barrier, the remaining strength of the Oroken would act as a floating fortress. They would use their guns to support the shore batteries, and most importantly, to defend the barrier against Japanese attempts to clear it. At the heart of this defiant, stationary fleet were its two most powerful units, the Ning Hai and the new flagship, the Ping Hai. The Japanese response was swift and brutal. They knew that if they were to push up the Yangtze and capture Nanking, the Jianyan barrier had to be broken and its defenders eliminated. They couldn't bring their battleships up the river, but they had another weapon in abundance: air power. The IJN had some of the best naval aviators in the world, flying modern, deadly aircraft from both land bases and the decks of their aircraft carriers, like the legendary Kaga. On September 21, 1937, the assault began. The initial waves of Japanese aircraft focused on the shore batteries and smaller ships. Then on the 22nd, they turned their full attention to the two cruisers, dozens of aircraft, dive bombers, level bombers, and fighters, swarmed over the trapped Chinese fleet. For the crews of the Ning Hai and Ping Hai, it was a vision of hell. The sky was black with enemy planes. But they didn't just sit and take it. They fought back with everything they had. Their anti-aircraft guns, a mix of Japanese and German models, roared into the sky. The sailors, knowing there was no escape, stood by their posts with incredible bravery. They managed to shoot down several of their attackers, a testament to their courage against such overwhelming odds. The Ping Hai, as the flagship, drew the most intense fire. She was hit again and again by bombs. One blasted her foredeck, another struck near the bridge. She began to list heavily, taking on water faster than her crews could pump it out. The Ning Hai rushed to her sister's aid, her own guns blazing. But she too became a primary target. Bombs rained down around her, shaking the ship with violent concussions. Direct hits tore through her decks. By the end of the day, both ships were battered, burning, and barely afloat. The attacks continued on the 23rd. The crippled Ping Hai was hit again and finally capsized, sinking into the muddy riverbed. The Ning Hai, having suffered at least 4 major bomb hits, also succumbed. She sank on an even keel, her battered superstructure and masts remaining defiantly above the shallow water. In just 2 days of relentless air assault, the heart of the Chinese Navy had been ripped out. For a while, it seemed their story was over. two brave but flawed ships that had died a heroic death defending their country. But their journey was only half done. In 1938, after the Japanese had captured the area, they saw the two sunken cruisers in the river. They were valuable scrap steel, at the very least. The Japanese launched a salvage operation, and with considerable effort, raised both wrecks from their muddy graves. The initial plan was to patch them up and hand them over to the new puppet government they had installed in China, a regime led by Wang Jingwei. They would be symbols of Pan-Asian cooperation. But the ships were too damaged, and as the wider war in the Pacific loomed, the Japanese decided they had better uses for them. The empty, damaged hulks were towed to the naval base at Sasebo, Japan. There, for several years, they served the most ignominious of purposes. They were tied to a pier and used as floating barracks and training hulks. The former flagships of China were now little more than immobile housing for their conquerors. But as World War II raged on, Japan's fortunes began to turn. By 1943 and 1944, American submarines were strangling the Japanese home islands, sinking the merchant ships that carried vital oil, rubber, and food. The IJN was desperately short of escort vessels, or kaibokan, to protect their convoys. They began converting anything that could float and carry a depth charge into an escort. And someone in the Naval Ministry remembered the two Chinese cruisers sitting idly at Sasebo. In a final bizarre twist, the decision was made to rebuild them and press them into service in the Imperial Japanese Navy. They were put into dry dock, and the extensive battle damage was finally repaired. Their original armament was stripped away. The heavy 140mm guns were replaced with more practical high-angle guns suitable for anti-aircraft defense. They were fitted with radar, sonar, and racks of depth charges. They were reborn, no longer cruisers, but dedicated convoy escorts. In June 1944, the Ning Hai was formally commissioned into the IJN as the escort ship Ioshima. Her sister, the Ping Hai, followed in September, recommissioned as the Yasoshima. The two ships that had fought so hard against the Japanese were now part of their navy, sailing under the Rising Sun flag. Their new life, however, would be brutally short. The Ioshima, the former Ning Hai, was assigned to escort duties. On September 19, 1944, while accompanying a convoy south of Honshu, she was spotted by the American submarine USS Shad. The submarine fired a spread of torpedoes. Two of them slammed into the small escort ship. The former Chinese flagship, survivor of the Battle of Jianmin, broke apart and sank for the second and final time, taking most of her Japanese crew with her. Her unwilling career in the IJN had lasted just 3 months. Her sister, Yasoshima, the former Ping Hai, lasted only 2 months longer. She was sent to the Philippines, the epicenter of a massive American counteroffensive. On November 25, 1944, while in Luzon Bay, she was caught by a huge wave of aircraft launched from U.S. Navy carriers. In a grim echo of her fate at Jianmin 7 years earlier, she was overwhelmed by air power. Bombs from American dive bombers ripped her apart, and she sank, joining a vast fleet of Japanese wrecks on the floor of the bay. And so the story ends. It is a story of incredible irony. Ships designed to defend China, built with Japanese hands that fought a heroic battle against Japan. Sunk, raised, and then forced to serve their enemies, only to be sunk again by their enemy's enemy. The Ning Hai and Ping Hai are a fascinating footnote, a testament to an era of complex politics and desperate measures. They were not great ships. They were slow, unstable, and hopelessly outmatched. But for a brief shining moment, they represented the hopes of a nation. They stood their ground against impossible odds, and their strange circular journey through war and peace, through service and servitude, makes them two of the most compelling and tragic warships ever to sail the seas. Their story is a powerful reminder that history is not just made by the grand fleets and the decisive battles, but also in the strange backwaters, in the stories of the flawed, the forgotten, and the doomed. The Ning Hai-class cruisers were all three, and their tale of a weapon turned against its master and then against its creator is one that deserves to be remembered. We hope you found this exploration into a forgotten corner of naval history as fascinating as we did. The story of the Ning Hai-class is a perfect example of how complex and ironic the lead-up to World War II truly was. These ships tell a story not just of naval design, but of national ambition, desperation, and the strange bedfellows that politics can create. If you enjoy uncovering these hidden histories and want to ensure you don't miss the next deep dive into military lore, make sure you are subscribed to the channel. Hitting that button is the best way to support our mission here. We are always on the hunt for new targets, for those stories that have been left in the footnotes of the history books. What military topic, vehicle, or battle are you burning to see covered? Drop your suggestions below. Consider it your mission briefing to us. We read every comment, and your ideas genuinely help shape the future of this channel. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.